Last Breath opens by introducing the perilous profession of saturation diving, where divers are responsible for maintaining underwater pipelines, one of the most hazardous occupations in the world. The scene then shifts to Chris Lemons, a promising yet inexperienced diver, who listens to a radio report about an impending storm set to strike Aberdeen, Scotland. Chris, newly recruited by Bibby Offshore, informs his fiancée, Morag, that he will be away for a month, having been selected for a saturation diving mission. Morag, acutely aware of the risks involved, feels uneasy, but Chris reassures her that he will be fine. At Aberdeen Harbour, Chris boards the dive support vessel, DSV, and is welcomed by his superior, Craig, and fellow diver, Duncan, who mentions that they will have a new captain for this mission. As the crew preps the ship for departure, Craig briefs them on their assignment. He explains that they will be confined to what he calls a tin can, a pressurized living chamber, for 28 days. They will operate at depths of 300 feet, about 90 meters, to replace a section of a gas pipeline. Once their task is completed, they will undergo a 4-day decompression process before returning to normal atmospheric pressure. Craig divides the crew into 3 teams. Chris, Duncan, and a seasoned diver named Dave are assigned to Team A. Chris has heard of Dave's stellar reputation, but has never worked alongside him. Dave, however, remains distant. Duncan, ever the good-natured one, playfully teases Dave for his aloof demeanor around Chris. Focused and professional, Dave questions Chris's experience. Duncan vouches for him, explaining that Chris previously worked as a deckhand for 3 years before earning his chance as a diver, having since completed 5 successful dives with Duncan. Later, as the team settles into their bunks, Dave notices Chris placing a photo of Morag beside his bed. Offering some wisdom, Dave advises Chris to remain focused underwater and not allow thoughts of the outside world to become a distraction. Duncan, lighthearted as always, reassures Chris, joking that Dave himself is a softie with 2 kids. With all teams accounted for, their chamber doors are sealed, and Craig initiates the gas pressurization process. Meanwhile, the vessel makes its way toward the Huntington oil field. The crew monitors the operation as Craig deactivates the gas compression system. Over the radio, Craig reiterates the importance of not leaving the chamber before decompression, warning that the gas saturating their bodies could cause life-threatening injuries. Duncan jokingly remarks that Craig gives the same speech every time. During a quiet meal, Duncan reveals that he was laid off by Bibby Offshore. To lighten the mood, Dave jokes that their job will likely be fully automated in 10 years. Chris suggests Duncan should move into management like Craig, but Duncan dismisses the idea, saying he isn't interested. He tells Dave honestly that he's a great diver and doesn't need him anymore. Early the next morning, Chris receives a video message from Morag detailing their wedding plans and encouraging him to have fun with Duncan. Meanwhile, after providing the boat's coordinates to Marine Control, the captain receives a warning that the approaching storm may be stronger than anticipated. Craig reassures him that they are in the North Sea, far from the storm's impact zone. Once the dynamic positioning system, DPS, is confirmed active, allowing the ship to maintain position without an anchor, the captain gives Craig the green light to commence the dive operation. Craig informs the team, and they begin donning their diving suits, equipped with flares, a knife, and a compass for added safety. Before entering the diving bell, Dave advises Chris to stay vigilant and follow his lead. Team A enters the diving bell, which gradually descends to 300 feet. Upon reaching depth, Craig announces their arrival. Duncan connects Dave's helmet to an umbilical cord, which supplies oxygen and communication, securing it firmly. Dave then plunges into the water, with Chris following closely behind. However, as Chris submerges, he becomes anxious and breathes heavily until Dave reassures him. Once the ship lowers the power cable, the divers begin their work. After successfully connecting the cable, they activate the manifold and report back to Craig. Everything proceeds smoothly until Chris notices that the gas readings inside the manifold are alarmingly high. As he attempts to correct the issue, the crew suddenly realizes the ship's thrusters have gone offline, meaning they can no longer hold position. The sea grows turbulent as the wind intensifies. Sensing imminent danger, Dave notices the vessel drifting and urgently orders Chris to move away from the manifold. On board, the DPS completely fails, leaving the crew without control over the ship. Craig immediately orders Duncan to abort the mission, instructing him to release as much umbilical slack as possible. As Dave and Chris climb onto the manifold to gain visibility, they realize they have lost sight of the bell. Suddenly, Chris's umbilical snags on the manifold. With the ship tilting due to the fierce winds and the power cable detaching, the seabed plunges into darkness. The team also discovers that the ship is not merely drifting. Chris's cord is acting as an anchor, tethered to the structure. Dave struggles to reach Chris, but the umbilical restricts his movement, and Chris's oxygen supply is rapidly depleting. Dave urgently instructs Chris to switch to his backup oxygen. Duncan informs Craig that Chris is now on bailout mode, meaning he has only 10 minutes of air left. Dave warns Chris that his umbilical cord is likely to snap, pulling him away from the structure. He instructs Chris to return to the manifold so they can locate him. Before Chris can react, his cord suddenly snaps, and he is dragged into the abyss. On board, Craig reports that they have lost visual contact with Chris. However, their remotely operated vehicle, ROV, captures footage of Dave returning to the bell. Upon reaching safety, Dave reports that Chris is gone. His cord was severed. Meanwhile, Chris ignites a flare and attempts to communicate with Duncan and Craig, but his calls go unanswered. Remembering Dave's instructions, he realizes he must navigate back to the manifold. The captain is informed that the ship's thrusters are functional again, but the DPS remains inoperative. Despite the risks, he and his first officer decide to manually steer the vessel to avoid drifting further from Chris's last known position. After considerable effort, they manage to turn the boat around. The DPO officer reports that they are now 630 feet away from the dive site. Meanwhile, Chris reaches the manifold and collapses onto it, thinking about Morag. The DPO officer suggests resetting the DPS, but the captain refuses, knowing it would take hours. Instead, he insists on finding an alternative solution. Finally, the ROV locates the manifold and spots Chris lying motionless on top of it, convulsing. Craig assumes the movements are involuntary spasms and fears Chris is dead. The DPO officer successfully rewires the system, restoring the DPS. With the ship now stabilized, the crew prepares for recovery. Duncan is informed that Chris is still on the manifold. Dave dives back into the water and retrieves Chris, but as he attempts to ascend, Chris's weight slows him down. After an exhausting effort, Dave manages to haul Chris into the bell. Craig immediately begins mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Chris appears lifeless, his eyes glassy and unresponsive, having been without oxygen for over 30 minutes. Just as the crew begins to lose hope, Chris suddenly gasps for air, shocking everyone. The entire crew erupts in celebration. Due to the traumatic ordeal, the captain decides to cut the mission short, and the team heads home. On the first day of decompression, Chris confides in Dave, revealing that while he was stranded, he felt an eerie sense of peace, though he was overwhelmed with sorrow, believing he had failed Morag. He expresses his gratitude to Dave for saving his life. On day 3, after bidding farewell to his team, Chris recounts the harrowing incident to Morag, who is deeply shaken. He reassures her with a promise that no matter what happens, he will always find his way back to her. And with that, the story comes to a close.